7-Eleven closing 444 underperforming stores across North America. The convenience store chain has more than 13,000 locations across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. The company says the closures are because of slowing sales the past 6 months, fewer cigarette purchases, and inflation.
It's very concerning when we see retailers, making decisions that they believe they have to make to close their doors.
There's a sign in the window. This 7-Eleven on Ellis Avenue is closed.
Imagine waking up one morning and discovering the single most recognizable store in your neighborhood gone. Lights off, windows papered, doors chained shut. The heart of your community, the late-night lifeline, the place you never imagined disappearing, suddenly wiped from the map overnight. Now multiply that unsettling moment by hundreds, because that's exactly what just happened across Canada, and nobody saw it coming. 7-Eleven, the chain that prides itself on never closing, that stays open during blizzards, recessions, blackouts, and even national emergencies, has done something unthinkable. It has abandoned entire regions of Canada, shutting down stores without warning, without explanation, and without a plan for the millions of Canadians who relied on them. And according to internal reports, more than 400 stores across North America are being cut, the largest contraction in the company's history. But here's where the story turns explosive. This isn't just about convenience stores. This is a full-blown economic alarm bell, a sign of a collapsing retail environment, a political failure years in the making, and the clearest evidence yet that something is fundamentally breaking in Canada's economic structure. Communities are shaken, business leaders are furious, and even Mark Carney, usually calm, calculated, unshakable, is now under mounting pressure as ignored warnings come back to haunt national leadership. Tonight, we're going to unpack the real reason 7-Eleven is abandoning Canada, how this crisis grew silently for years, and why these closures expose deep fractures in Canada's economy, politics, and future. Stay with me, because once you understand what's happening, you'll realize this isn't the end of 7-Eleven. It might be the beginning of something much bigger. The first shockwave hit quietly, closed signs appearing on store windows, lights out, parking lots empty. Communities initially assumed these were temporary renovations, but soon they realized the truth. This wasn't maintenance. It was retreat. According to reports, 7-Eleven began shutting down 444 underperforming stores across North America, citing slowing sales, plunging cigarette purchases, and rising inflation as the core triggers of collapse. For a chain that operates over 13,000 locations, this was more than a cutback, it was a survival tactic. But Canada wasn't just part of the contraction. It became ground zero. Some closures weren't even on the initial list. 2 more locations shut down without warning, creating confusion and panic among residents and employees alike. The abrupt disappearance felt personal. For decades, 7-Eleven had projected stability, a constant presence even when other businesses folded. So when they began locking their doors, communities asked a chilling question. If 7-Eleven can't survive here, what can? The issue wasn't just retail decline. It was a sign of deeper structural stress, and the pressure had been building long before the public noticed. This was merely the first crack in a system, straining far beyond its limits. 7-Eleven isn't like other retailers. It's engineered to survive turbulence. High overhead? Yes. Thin margins? Yes. But flexible, resilient, and adaptable? Absolutely. This chain is historically a storm-proof business model. It survived recessions that wiped out entire competitors. It thrived despite rising labor costs, changing consumer behavior, and technological disruption. So for a giant like this to abandon regions of Canada, something catastrophic had to be unfolding. The transcript reveals that this wasn't a gradual shift. It was a sudden collapse. Neighborhoods woke to boarded-up windows and no explanation from the corporation. In a world where corporate PR teams over-explain everything, silence speaks volumes. And the implications were immediate. Workers left jobless overnight late-night essentials, became inaccessible families already battling inflation, saw their costs rise, neighborhoods lost their safety hubs, local suppliers lost guaranteed contracts. But perhaps the most dramatic impact was psychological. If a store that's built to survive anything couldn't manage Canada's economic climate, people began questioning the stability of every other business in their community. What happens when the only accessible store in a rural town disappears? What happens when a darkened storefront becomes a symbol of national uncertainty? The answer became clearer as more regions reported closures. and some provinces suffered far more than others. The closures weren't evenly spread. Western Canada got hit the hardest. Nearly half of all Canadian 7-Eleven locations are in Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, with Alberta hosting the largest concentration nationwide. These provinces aren't just contributors. They are the backbone of the national economy, driving energy production, transportation, and exports. So why were they left exposed? As the document highlights, these regions had been warning for years about rising crime, rising operating costs, and rising risk, long before 7-Eleven's retreat began. Crime rates surged to the point where some stores lost hundreds of thousands of dollars per year due to theft, with staff facing dangerous situations on a regular basis. And yet, nothing meaningful was done. Businesses begged for federal and provincial support, stronger enforcement, and updated policies. But those pleas fell on deaf ears. So when economic pressure reached its tipping point, the places already struggling were the first to fall. In big cities, losing a convenience store is annoying. In rural Alberta or Manitoba, it's destabilizing. These stores weren't just retail points. They were safe zones, supply hubs, and community anchors. Their disappearance fractured daily life in ways policymakers failed to anticipate. This next part is where the political angle explodes. For years, convenience store owners and retail groups directly warned Canadian leadership, including Mark Carney, that their margins were shrinking at dangerous rates. The document spells it out clearly. Operating costs were rising faster than revenue. Crime was becoming uncontrollable. Regulations on tobacco/vaping were eliminating their highest margin items. Insurance premiums were skyrocketing. Energy costs made 24-hour operations nearly impossible. Foot traffic was steadily declining. Consumer spending was collapsing under inflation. These weren't complaints. They were lifeline warnings from the ground level, the people who could see the economic iceberg before anyone in Ottawa even acknowledged the fog. Yet leadership continued projecting confidence. Retailers weren't exaggerating. They were describing a system on the edge. And now that closures are appearing across the map, we're witnessing the exact consequences they predicted. A store like 7-Eleven doesn't shut down because of one bad quarter. It shuts down because multiple structural failures converge at once: policy, crime, inflation, labor, regulatory burdens, forming a perfect storm no business can navigate. The collapse wasn't sudden. The warnings were just ignored. Here's the twist almost no Canadian remembers, but it might be the most important part of the story. Years ago, Canada had a chance to own 7-Eleven outright. A Canadian company, Couche-Tard, parent of Circle K, attempted a massive multi-billion-dollar acquisition to take control of 7-Eleven's Japanese parent company. If successful, Canada would have gained full strategic control over the entire chain, including which stores closed, which modernized, and which regions received investment. But Japan rejected the deal outright, and that single decision changed the course of Canada's retail destiny. Instead of domestic oversight, decisions are now being made from overseas boardrooms with zero understanding of or responsibility to Canadian communities. As the document states, Canada had no authority when the company initiated its shutdown wave, and communities had no voice, no warning, and no ability to intervene. Imagine how different this crisis might be if Canada had kept decision-making power at home. Instead, the closures now represent a painful reminder. The disappearance of these stores triggered effects far beyond economics. Communities lost much more than a place to buy snacks. They lost their nighttime safety. Lighting their kids' after-school meetings spots their emergency late-night supply, stops their informal community, hubs their sense of stability and normalcy. The document describes how some areas relied on their local 7-Eleven as the only accessible option for miles, especially in rural and working-class neighborhoods. Removing that anchor didn't just inconvenience residents, it destabilized them. Families suddenly had to travel further and pay more for basic goods. Elderly residents lost walkable access to essentials. Small local suppliers lost distribution partners. Delivery drivers lost routes. A whole ecosystem collapsed in the shadows of these closures. And perhaps the most haunting outcome, the emotional effect. 7-Eleven isn't a luxury brand. It's woven into everyday life. Childhood memories, family routines, late-night conversations, road trips, and community rhythms. Seeing these stores vanish created a sense of economic erosion so visible that even political reassurances couldn't hide it. Every darkened sign became a symbol. Something is wrong, very wrong. As closures spread, Canadians began asking the questions leaders weren't ready to answer. If a chain built to weather economic storms can't survive here, what does that say about everything else? If 7-Eleven falls, what happens when pressure reaches grocery stores, pharmacies, transportation networks, or essential services? The transcript ends with a series of haunting questions. Questions Canada must now confront head-on. How many more pieces of daily life are at risk of disappearing next? How far will these closures spread if conditions don't improve? What happens when retail, one of the country's largest employment sectors, begins collapsing from the bottom up? This isn't just a retail story. It's the clearest indicator yet that Canada's economic stress is reaching a breaking point. Crime, inflation, policy misalignment, declining consumer spending, and foreign corporate control have merged into a structural threat no community can ignore. These closures aren't isolated events. They're warnings, brutal, visible warnings, about the fragility of the systems Canada relies on. Tonight, the question isn't, why did 7-Eleven close? The real question is, what closes next? The collapse of 7-Eleven in Canada isn't a story about a convenience store chain. It's a story about political decisions coming back to haunt the country, economic fractures deepening beyond repair, communities being left behind without support, corporate decisions made overseas affecting Canadian lives, a retail environment collapsing from pressure. No one addressed this moment matters, because it exposes the truth leadership avoided for years. Canada isn't facing a temporary downturn. It's facing a structural shift, and the first casualties are the businesses closest to the public. When 7-Eleven, a company built to survive recessions, inflation, and market chaos, can no longer operate in major parts of Canada, it reveals the scale of stress that other sectors will face next. This story matters because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about crime, inflation, regulation, consumer behavior, foreign ownership, and national economic direction. It matters because Canadians deserve transparency, not silence. It matters because communities deserve protection, not abandonment. And most importantly, it matters because this is just the beginning. If you've stayed with me until now, you already understand what most political leaders won't admit. Canada is entering a new and uncertain chapter, and stories like this are the warning signs. At Red Leaf Politics, we don't sugarcoat reality, we expose it. We follow the data, the silence, the decisions made behind closed doors, and the consequences Canadians feel first. So if you want political commentary that cuts through the noise, that asks the hard questions, that challenges power instead of flattering it, this is your place. Hit like, drop a comment, share this video with someone who needs to understand what's happening, and most importantly, subscribe to Red Leaf Politics. Because the next chapter is already unfolding, and you deserve to know the truth before it hits your doorstep.